Are you satisfied with your understanding of sustainability? If you are not, imagine a journey together, a pluralistic one, with academia, innovators, startups, NGOs, all looking for solutions to the greatest challenge of our time. My name is Samuele Tini, and this is the Sustainability Journey.
Welcome to another episode. Today, we are going to meet a change maker, somebody that has a expertise in energy, who is a global sustainability expert, a change maker, somebody who also has dealt in entrepreneurship, being a co-founder, board member, and until this year also the president of Intercontinental Energy. So I'm very happy and pleased to meet Alicia Eastman. Thank you so much, Alicia, for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
And Alicia, you are a global expert on energy, and we know how important is the energy transition for our sustainability journey as a species and as a planet. But before that, we want to know a bit about you. What is your sustainability journey? Which experiences have led you to become a global sustainability leader?
I grew up at a time when we had realized that global warming was happening. The greenhouse effect was very well established in a lot of the curriculum in the United States. We thought a lot about, the issue at hand. I guess it was before it became extremely political, and then it was taken out of the curriculum. But, in the 80s and, I guess late 70s, early 80s, this was absolutely considered factual because, we had seen what was happening. And I used to have a recurring nightmare, almost every night when I was in first or second grade about racing against the entire planet for the last recyclable box that had like a plant. And so the carbon dioxide and the oxygen actually work together. And it was such a stressful dream because I was racing all of these people for one box. And then, I was really worried about getting the box, but I was also really worried that none of them would get the box. And then I didn't want to live in a box. So, it was a really horrible nightmare. And it led me to really get into the problem solving on that and to learn as much about it as possible. And I studied quite a lot of it when I was younger, and then it sort of disappeared out of curriculum. And obviously that was a lot of lobbying on the behalf of fossil fuels industry and different politicians in the United States. I speak only for the United States because I don't know what was going on elsewhere, but obviously there was a lot of inaccurate information that was provided to Congress and to the public, and Exxon had the most incredible projection that is so perfect for what has actually happened with global warming, but then they lied about it. So that wasn't so helpful. But, so I've always been interested in it. I did always think that we would find a way to solve it, that we would find a technology, we would find ways to use less energy, we would find ways to clean and to do things that would sort of would stop the industry that I went into right away. I'd done energy over the years, and before starting ICE as a co-founder about 10 years ago, I was mostly in private equity. And when I say private equity, I mean anywhere from like incubation to seed to VC to growth to I didn't really do buyouts. So mostly like helping companies grow. No firing people. It was mostly helping companies grow. And I invested in a number of different renewables or environmentally oriented technologies, things that would help us use less energy to do the same things, or to even support a huge growing population, but with less energy. And so this is something I was very interested in. And then I had worked a lot with a fellow named Alex Tancock, who's the co-founder. And he had this idea that's basically because he had been a renewables developer his whole career, doing projects all over the world, mostly small projects because the projects were small in the beginning and then they got bigger and bigger. But he had realized that the best sites actually to make renewables, to have green electrons, are these coastal deserts because they have sun all day long and they have really strong wind at night. And that combination means you'll get the absolute cheapest green electrons in the world. And we looked at where these sites are in the world, and they were mostly in the MENA region and in Australia, a little bit in Latin America. And so we decided to go after those sites. And because I had had a JV in Saudi since 2007 and had a lot of experience in the Gulf and had a lot of relationships. He also had worked in Australia and had a lot of relationships in Australia. We sort of split that, and I really focused on getting the right partners for a project in Oman in the Gulf. And also we have the Australia project. That's sort of how I got from the beginning to the end. Yeah, so I mean, I would say that the sort of the red thread in my whole life has been that I'm very interested in different cultures and different parts of the world, and also civil rights and justice. And so, I read a lot of history and knew about what was going on in a lot of parts of the world. And I was interested in helping with development. So even for grad school, I went to the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, Tufts, which focuses, I mean, I'd say a third of the people go to development banks, a third are doing international business, and then a third are doing NGOs. And I thought that I would go to a development bank. This is where I actually thought I would make the most impact. But actually, I ended up starting private equity funds of my own and just investing in developing countries. And so the reasoning was always that, I wanted to bring wealth and growth, and also in many cases, reduce pollution and make life more comfortable and livable and not just for those locations, but for the world. And so I've always been focused on developing countries as well. And so this idea really fit in well. Australia is not exactly a developing country, but it does have a lot of native title owners of the land who have not always been treated. They've been treated horrifically in many cases. And then, of course, in the Middle East, you also have a lot of sort of Bedouin or nomadic communities that, are suffering from a lack of water or too much water or all the different crazy things that are happening with the weather. So this was sort of a perfect fit for me to focus on both those things.
Oh, thank you. And from the box to now the investing and now the project that we will discuss in the renewable energies and the work, especially in areas, in the different areas of the planet. But before going a bit deeper in your role and the work, I want to ask a bit question, because as an expert and somebody that's been developing and working at the forefront for renewable, I want to understand what is the challenge opportunities for the energy sector. We all know that is critical for our transition, but we are still behind the pace of the transformation that required for achieving our objective.
I think, and most people would probably agree with me on this, but the basic fact that, the pollution and all of the negative externalities of using fossil fuels are not internalized, they are socialized. That is the biggest problem that we face, because everyone is under the illusion that, oil and gas and coal are very cheap. They're not cheap. They're very expensive. And it's not governments or rich people paying for it. It's the average taxpayer of any in any country, because the people who are living next to the refineries have worse health outcomes. The everything that we pay for because of all of this just ability to pollute into the air. I mean, in the United States, we had the Clean Water Act for, since the 70s or something. I think since Nixon. And, at some point, GE was dumping chemicals into the Ohio River and set it on fire. Now, GE did not go back to the regulatory bodies and say, well, I have to dump my chemicals in the river because otherwise I won't make as much money. That will really get into my profit margin, right? That's not an acceptable response when you've set the Ohio River on fire. But somehow, this has been an acceptable response for the entire fossil fuels industry. And it has been, they are able to internalize all profitability and socialize all of these negative externalities, all these things that cost countries, costs us not just through global warming, but through health outcomes, through all sorts of ways. And so we're all paying for it right now. And if we're able to have, less pollution, and we're able to have fuels to replace that are greener and that are clean, everyone will be better off, not just from a point of view of health and for global warming, but actually their pocketbooks, because it's coming out of normal taxpayers' pockets. It's not coming, it's not coming from wealthy people. It's coming from the poorest. And they're affected the worst too, because they usually live next to landfills and they live next to refineries. And, it's just, who are going to be the future climate refugees? It's going to be poor people. There's already people moving from Latin America and from Africa because they cannot grow anything. They can't predict what the weather will be to even plant correctly. I think that, so obviously this goes back to my social justice. I think that it's really important that we have to have a tax on emissions. We have to have a cost to emissions. So, you have to have, first of all, an ability to track the emissions all the way from flaring to your final product, or if it's green, it's upstream wind and solar to your final product. You need to be able to have an emissions intensity number and be able to compare apples to apples. And if that emissions intensity is higher, then either a tax is paid or there's no market for it. So, in Europe, there will be no market for hydrogen that has only removed 30% of the CO2, right? There will be no market for that. Right now, there probably is, because there's no real rules around, how you track the emissions intensity. But we've got that. Like at COP, we got 60 countries to sign on, which is about 80% of the total trade, to agree to the same methodology in order to calculate the emissions intensity all the way up to selling to the customer. So instead of saying blue and green and pink and all this stuff, we've got a number we can compare apples to apples. And then we never have to hear this term green premium ever again, because it is a completely illogical way of looking at things. A green premium indicates that, I bought my hydrogen and it came in a box with a really pretty bow on it. And I also got a massage and I stayed in a 5-star hotel. That's not what this is about. The cost of green hydrogen is the cost of green hydrogen. The issue is the cost of fossil fuels that do not do carbon capture is not the cost, because they have not internalized all of these different aspects that I've spoken about. So once you get that straightened, where they are internalizing it, where you can see the emissions intensity number, then we can compare apples to apples. And we will no longer be using terms like green premium, because the premium will be for the dirty product, because that will cost more.
And then for the benefit of our audience, because since you are a global expert and you have discussed a bit already, the hydrogen that is heralded in some publication and work as a game changer, something that can really support. But for the benefits of lay people like me and the others, can you explain a bit more about this source of energy? What is it? And then all the color, blue, white, yellow, pink, rainbow, because we in the press, we bombard with different things and maybe sometimes we are not able to understand.
So hydrogen basically is easy to make in a green way by splitting water. So essentially, if you start with upstream wind and solar, or even hydro, or, geothermal, these are clean ways to produce energy. One of the reasons that we focused on the diurnal profile is because you have that strong sun all day long, and then you have the wind all night long. So that means that the major issue with renewables, which is intermittency, is actually overcome. And you're able to, not just with the not just with the choice of site that is these coastal deserts, but also with the layout of the plants, with the way that you lay it out. You try to avoid any need for storage. You're using your own transportation, your own interconnections, and your own layout of the project to store so that you always have dispatchable power so that you can run. And I'll just give you an example. So this is an off-grid example of an integrated project to do downstream, something tradable downstream that can be shipped. So you're in a coastal desert. You bring in the salt water because you don't want to waste, good clean water in a desert. You have your extremely cheap green electrons, right? Because the wind and solar are the cheapest in the world as long as the resource is there. You desalinate the water. You use the water yourself, but you also use it for the community around you, for industry, for residents, for potentially food security. You can grow food under PV panels. There's lots of things that you can do, and you can actually build topsoil even in a desert, using the excess oxygen from when you split the water. So after you have your desalinated water, then you use electrolysis to split the water into its two components, which is the chemistry most people actually know. H2O is hydrogen and oxygen. Everyone knows that. They may not think about it, but of course they know it. And so you divide it and you have a lot of excess oxygen, which could potentially be used to speed up the process of making topsoil. Because if you add that oxygen, it metabolizes faster if you add it to compost or some kind of fertilizer. And that's like a really good use of this excess oxygen. But the hydrogen is what you're going for because that's the energy. And so then you take the hydrogen, and if you want to make ammonia, then you would take nitrogen from the air and combine it with the hydrogen, which is using a 100-year-old process, the Haber-Bosch process. And just to give you an idea of how different that is from, say, trying to take CO2 from the air, about 70% of our atmosphere is nitrogen. So if I take my hand up and I grab the air in my hand, I have nitrogen in my hand. So it's obviously not as hard to get nitrogen out of the air to combine it with the hydrogen in order to make ammonia. But if you want to do direct air capture of CO2 to take it out of the atmosphere, CO2 is only like 0.004% of the atmosphere. So such a little amount is doing so much damage. It is it's very frightening, actually. And it is very hard to get that CO2 because, it is such a small part. So that means you have to take in tons of air and then separate. No one has really come up with an inexpensive way to do that yet. Hopefully they will. So once you have your ammonia, you can, and I'm picking ammonia because ammonia makes the most sense right now for a number of different applications. If you wanted to liquefy hydrogen, you could also use that and you could ship it, but you would have to ship it at negative 253 degrees Celsius. And that's 20 degrees above absolute zero. For ammonia, it can be at 10 bar pressure at ambient temperatures, or you can take it to negative 33 degrees Celsius, which is very, very, it's not as big a deal at all, obviously, as negative 253 degrees, but it's also much, much better than LNG and other ways that they've tried to move gas. So ammonia actually is cheaper and easier to transport, and you retain more energy, right? Because you're not losing it to keeping it cold. It is also not very flammable as another benefit, actually. You can't just light a match and throw it on an ammonia tank an ammonia barrel, and it probably wouldn't do much. So actually you have a starter. You have to sort of start it when you're using it as, say, a shipping fuel. The ammonia then can be used in a bunch of different ways. So originally people thought we're going to use it as a transport vector. We'll take it to where we're using it, and then it'll crack it back to hydrogen. But increasingly, we've found that ammonia is actually better. So you can use it as a shipping fuel, which for long distance shipping, hydrogen would definitely not be possible. And one of the things that is counterintuitive is that in the same amount of space, ammonia has twice the energy of hydrogen. So if you have a ship and you have the same amount of space, you'll have more energy with the ammonia than with the hydrogen, which is very counterintuitive because I just said I added nitrogen. Like how could it, it doesn't make sense, but it is because of the speed that the hydrogen moves around. And so either it has to be really, it has to be liquefied or it has to have really high pressure. So that's one of the main reasons. But now that we've realized you can use ammonia in an internal combustion engine. So basically, there are a number of companies that have created ammonia engines for shipping. MAN has one that is coming out next year for purchase. A lot of people are on the wait list. They're right on schedule. They're very excited about it. Maersk Tankers has ordered, actually even Maersk has ordered, and a number of other companies, and especially in Japan and Korea and Saudi, the ammonia ships that is what is expected to be the fuel for shipping, to decarbonize shipping. Now, there's a lot of safety things that have to be considered, but a lot of these ships have not been redesigned in 40 plus years, and they have very small crews. And they have a lot of inefficiencies. So it's an opportunity to build a new ship that, takes care of a lot of the inefficiencies, can add wind and solar and a lot of things so that you're using as little fuel as possible and also switching to the green fuel. That is something that people are working on. And it's surprisingly easy to build a new ship. It's a 1 to 2 year design and build, experience. Whereas with aviation, it'll be 20 years before we can use a different fuel. So aviation is very much stuck with something called, which is SAF, sustainable aviation fuel, but it's essentially e-kerosene. And e-kerosene is really similar to methanol. So the shipping industry is starting with methanol because it doesn't really it's not that different from diesel, but it's not that different from diesel in terms of helping the environment because, you're still, all of this is going into the environment. And whereas ammonia can actually burn cleanly, you don't have to have any emissions if you use ammonia and you put in the right facilities, because there's something called NOx, which a lot of people use to scare people because NOx sounds really scary. But it's basically nitrogen with one oxygen or two oxygens. And you need to find a way to separate those so that it acts like your normal atmosphere where the oxygen and the nitrogen are separate. Oxygen's doing its thing, nitrogen's doing its thing. You don't want them together. But this has been solved like 30 years ago. And actually the thing that solves it, ironically, is ammonia. So there's been an incredible, an invention of something called an ammonia pill, which you basically put inside, and then when the exhaust comes through, it divides it back into the hydrogen and the oxygen, and so you don't have to have any kind of emissions. So it's really good for shipping in particular, but also they've done a lot of studies showing that to make green steel, you might not even need hydrogen for that. You might be able to actually use ammonia, and that might actually be less difficult than using hydrogen. One, because you can store it for far longer because of the issues with the coldness, but also it's just the reaction when you're making the steel, the ammonia actually works better. And then the like Fe, like the steel particles, they attach to the side of the pipe. And then the oxygen and the nitrogen, most in this case, the nitrogen just shoots right up and you don't have to separate it even. So it actually naturally does its own separation. So there was a Max Planck study on that recently. They're looking into it further, but there seems to be a lot of different ways that we can use it that are far beyond fertilizer and some of the existing markets for ammonia.
Since now you have been co-founder, board director, and president of Intercontinental Energy. So you can discuss a bit the mission, what is it, and the other part. And the second point is that how you are, if you can go a bit deeper, give them some example how you are using these strategies, technologies to deliver that. Because it's one place is, of course, the research and work, and now how you are delivering it to the consumers and really enabling the transition.
I think what people don't really understand about hydrogen is that the most important thing is the cost of energy and that the energy is green, right? Because if you really think about carbon capture, if you start with gas, you have to start with the flaring and you have to start, and then you have to have this carbon capture technology, which removes the carbon, which is very difficult. It's okay for 35%, but it gets to be very difficult at 60%, and it's extremely difficult at 90%, which is where we would want people to be. And it's expensive. And so I think that the key to having clean hydrogen is to having the cheapest clean energy. And if you look at the cost of hydrogen and the cost of ammonia or the cost of methanol or any of the downstream products that you can make from hydrogen, the majority is the cost of power. It is all about the cost of the energy. And so that energy has to be both green and it has to be cheap. And so where you build the project is the most important aspect of the production of this fuel. And so I think that is the thing that people, have to focus on first, because you can't build and economies of scale were really important to us, of course. So that's why the projects are so large. The one in Oman is going to be 25 gigawatts of upstream wind and solar, which would make it the biggest power project in the world right now. And that project has been partnered with Shell. But there's another project with the first one we announced, which was in Australia. That's the Australian Renewable Energy Hub. That's 26 gigawatts of upstream wind and solar. So, and then we partnered that with BP. So those two projects are gigantic and they're moving along. They're on huge areas of land, although the actual footprint is not that big. You just need a lot of land to keep the wind turbines apart. Otherwise, you're stealing wind from yourself. So you have to spread out the wind turbines. But it's literally the rows are 5 kilometers apart. So you can't even see another row. And then each turbine is 1 kilometer apart from the next. So it's not like they're all bunched up together on a hillside. And that's the other important thing. Having a very flat, uniform, large site, you're going to get the absolute cheapest, most reliable energy. And it's really important when you not as important for hydrogen. I mean, it's important, obviously, that you maximize your CapEx as much as possible. So if you're going to buy a bunch of electrolyzers, but you're only running them 24% of the time, well, that's not going to be as efficient as if you're running them all the time. But when you get to things like ammonia or methanol or things that are, glass or all these things that you manufacture, you never want to shut those down. It is very, very expensive to shut down a major manufacturing facility. So it's very important that the inputs, both the energy and the hydrogen, and that it all is available all the time. And that can only happen if you have an extremely large site where you have the ability to basically offset. If one area has a cloud over it, the other doesn't. And you have a much higher chance of being able to have dispatchable energy all the time. And of course, we put storage into places so that you can change the compression, which means that you can basically store hydrogen for different periods of time based on your needs, and adapts really quickly.
I want to understand because there is a lot of discussion, and sorry, again, the lay person that is listening and talking to the expert. So there are a lot of discussions about hydrogen deployment and change, and as I say, in the shipping and transportation in our energy. And then you are a member of different advisory councils, boards. So which are really the policies that you believe in? Which are the steps also maybe government or enterprise they have to do to unlock this hydrogen revolution? Because there is a lot of discussions in the press, but we have not yet seen maybe sometimes feeling the people have seen this transformation, this revolution?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that there have been a number of things that have already occurred that are really helpful. So in Europe, you have something called the CBAM. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's the cross-border adjustment mechanism. And effectively, it is a tax on the carbon for products that were made using pollutive means. So you can't get your steel from a country that doesn't care about the environment and allows you to just pollute into the atmosphere and then ship it into Europe. Europe requires an emissions intensity on that steel so that they can compare apples to apples. And so exactly what I was describing with hydrogen, that you need to be able to agree on the methodology of calculating the assessment of the emissions intensity. That is also true of products that are mostly made of energy. So steel is a highly energy, the majority of the cost is the energy. So for any of these types of products, the idea is that you also have an energy intensive intensity number, and they will not allow in products that, don't meet a certain standard. And they will also, be charging a tax essentially on the differential. So that if you don't meet that standard, I mean, in some cases they just won't let it in, but in some cases it would just be a tax on that. And another industry in shipping, there was a MEPC 80 last summer. I don't know if you know how the IMO works, the International Maritime Organization, but it has like 180 member states, most of whom are global south. And IMO regulates shipping in the entire world. It's one of the very few industries that has one regulator for the entire world. They agreed in that last summer that they would have both a capital costs or a charge for having pollution, and they would also have fuel standards. So fuel standards as well as some kind of tax. Now they don't like to use the word tax, so we'll call it whatever you want, but it is a monetary incentive. And essentially in 2025, which is next year, they will announce what those terms are. So what the cost will be, and any shipping that occurs using normal diesel and produces pollution, they will have to pay a tax basically on that. And the use of those tax revenues will be to help the global south so that they can actually make green fuels, or they can use green fuels, or they can offset the actual penalty on them. Because, we really have to look at this. This problem was caused by Europe and the United States and a number of what we would now call global north countries. It was not caused by these places, that don't have a lot of energy, that have 13% energy penetration. It was not caused by them, right? But we need everybody to participate, because we can't just have one clean portion of the world. We have to solve this problem on a global basis. So the issue is, how do we solve this problem without penalizing these countries that are trying to grow and, had nothing to do with the situation we find ourselves in now? One way structuring this with the IMO is that you can use the tax revenues collected to help these countries, not only to offset the penalty of the higher price of using a green fuel, but to help them actually take advantage of the resources that are in their countries, because a lot of times they do have a lot of wind and solar or geothermal or hydro, and they could be making green fuels, and they could be actually benefiting from the hydrogen economy. And that could be super exciting. This is something where they could leapfrog. They don't need to even have the fossil fuel infrastructure. They can be working with renewables from the start. And there are a lot of global south countries that fit this. And some that don't, they can be part of the supply chain. They could be building electrolyzers. They could be building PV. We could be, making the sources of our supply chain more diverse, more resilient, better than, say, PV being controlled by one country, 90% of all PV being controlled by one country, right? We clearly need to diversify, but also these can be like really good markets for a number of countries that are considered global south. So the idea is like, how do we do this? How do we talk to all these countries and find a way for them to benefit? And once that happens, then you have agreement from everyone to take this road. I think that those conversations are happening, and there are a lot of really good examples of ways that can work. And you'll have that extra revenue coming in to help build the infrastructure and all sorts of other things that will have to happen. But I think this is a good example of it actually making change. So whatever the rules are will be announced in 2025. The rules existing in those two categories has been agreed. 2025, what the sort of penalty is, or how the money will actually be used, will be set in 2025. And then it will take effect in 2027. So, people have a little bit of time to get things together. But that's huge. And that is, they just elected the Secretary General of the IMO, the new one, last year. So he started in January. So we have 8 years of Arsenio Dominguez, who is an incredible negotiator, an incredible defender of the global south and of all of the member states that form a part of the IMO. And his focus has been the environment. So I think we have a really good shot of getting something done that, is across the board great.
No, definitely, I can see a lot of discussion since we are in the global south. I can see this important part. Even I'm sitting on the Rift Valley talking to you. So this is the geothermal power and sun that we have. So for the ammonia and transition, and it's really important what you just said, due to the immense growth, population growth and economic growth that is forecast in the next 20 years for our side of the world. And I say finally, the IMF say the African century and discussion. We need what you said, the leapfrogging. You not using the same path. We don't have to follow what was done in the global north, what was done in China. We need to change the narrative and use this technology and ammonia and other due to the available and cheap energy. I hope you can also look at Kenya and our region as one of the hubs for your next
geothermal, yeah.
and geothermal and work. So, and then how do you envision the role of private sector really driving this transition to sustainable energy? Do you see now companies are embarking on that? There is a momentum and push. And how do you see the transformation coming?
If we just stay within shipping, I see an incredible passion to change and to make this a less pollutive industry. I mean, shipping touches every part of the world. It is an incredibly important integrated part of the world economy. And it is pollutive, and it is, it's like, honestly, the worst garbage is put into ships to run on. The bunkering fuel is the worst of the worst. So to have it switched to no emissions is, quite important. So I think that there are lots of private sector entities, family offices, shipping is there's a lot of family businesses, but lots of different entities that are trying to push it forward. One thing that you will never really separate is energy from government, though. I mean, it is so essential, and whether it's because the government owns the energy companies, so the national oil company is owned by whichever government, or you have a situation where you have politicians who are never going to let the price of energy go up when they're trying to run for office, right? It's the worst thing that can happen to a politician is to have the cost of energy be high when they're trying to get to office. So it is, is considered just so. I don't think that it will ever be detached from government. It is always going to be private-public partnerships, and you're always going to rely on regulations to enforce. And there's a number of other things that have to be enforced that would governments have to get behind. So you need to have some kind of book and claim to get us moving faster. You have to have ways for people to get offsets so that, in places where things just aren't available, they're at least able to make it available to somebody else on the other side of the world so that, net less pollution happens and, therefore we're able to turn around the global warming. So those things are going to be coordinated by transnational, but certainly it's governments, whether it's as a part of, the UN or some other entity, or whether it's the actual governments themselves. But if you really think about a tradable market for any of these things, we all have to agree on what the terms are and how it works. And this is why this, last year on the sidelines of the G20 in Goa, they established the International Hydrogen Trading Forum. And this entity is composed of a number of different groups like Hydrogen Council and SEM and the UNIDO and a number of different entities. But essentially, it's so that everyone can follow the same pattern and use the same math when they calculate their emissions intensity. And so that we can compare apples to apples, and we don't ever have to talk about blue or pink or yellow, and you don't even need to learn what those mean because they are irrelevant. What's relevant is the amount of pollution produced and the product, right? That you have a green product. So it's important that we be open-minded about how it can be produced, but we also have to know exactly what we're actually putting into the atmosphere or not putting into the atmosphere so we can compare and meet the different standards of different countries. So different countries are going to have different regulations, right? I mean, Europe is going to have a stronger regulatory framework than the US probably, for some time, or certainly a lot of other countries. Japan has taken a really big role in this and are really pushing shipping and also co-firing with ammonia. And I think but each country has its own right to have its own sort of regulations. So they will allow in different emissions intensity as long as it meets their goal and what they've committed to in terms of reducing pollution overall. And so the agreement is also to have this sort of mutual recognition of different regulations in different countries. But the thing that's absolutely necessary is that we're using the same methodology to determine what the content is of these materials.
Thank you, Alicia. It's been a very intensive episode with full of concepts, and I really like. And the last question I want to launch to you very quickly, like from your expertise and your point of view as a global expert, how do you see evolving the sector in the next maybe decade or even less than decade, as we know the 2030, we put 2030 as our objective. And maybe if you can give us what is the role you want to play in our decade for restoration?
I think that the most important sectors to focus on, and possibly the easiest sectors to focus on, are incredibly boring. They are chemicals, they are steel, they are shipping, they are, a lot of like the aluminum, copper, anything that requires a lot of energy in order to smelt or to build with. It's not about what people use to put in their homes. It's not about whether you put, it's not about the car you drive. Frankly, the car you drive, the biggest problem with the car you drive right now is probably the steel that went into making it. And now it's sitting in your driveway or wherever you live. It's sitting there not being used. I mean, that's an issue, So I think that the war is to be won with the really boring industries, but that's what's causing the most problems. And it's been kind of a trick on the part of fossil fuel companies to make people feel personally responsible and that it's all about your plastic bags and it's all about your consumption. And at the end of the day, obviously I don't think you should go using plastic bags and throwing them around. But the point is that the majority of the problem is on an industrial scale, and it's industrial users And it's the companies themselves not, flaring can be a lot cleaner. There's so many ways to reduce the amount of energy that is wasted and also causing pollution. So, there needs to be motivation for that. But I think this war is won in those very boring sectors, and that is where I intend to play a role. So I am really focused on, I speak a lot about shipping, as you know, and so in this conversation alone, but my interests are in all of the more industrial silos. And I also think because they are kind of like silos, it's really important to have somebody that's looking at all of them at once. Because if shipping wants to use methanol and they need to use, biogenic CO2 to make the methanol, there's not a lot of biogenic CO2 in the world. So if aviation needs kerosene for their SAF, they also need biogenic CO2. But aviation is not going to have a new plane and a new fuel for 20 years, like a really new fuel, like an ammonia. So shipping is going to use ammonia because they can build a new ship, just gravity. They can build a new ship and it's going to float. It's not as complicated as the aviation. And so you really need to be looking at both so that you know what's going to be available for which. And it's clearly obvious if you look at both that aviation is going to get the majority of that biogenic CO2 because that's all they have. And they've said they have goals. They're going to do X by 2030. But if you talk to them and you say, like, what's your plan? Are you going to use, a lot of people always suggest biofuels. Tell that to an aviation person or a shipping person that has to meet a deadline by 2030, and their face will turn white because there's not enough biofuels. There's never enough biofuels. And when there ever becomes enough, it either, one, they become very, very expensive, or B, they become actually negative to the environment. You're competing with other arable land.
Or even human food. So as happens sometimes, I mean, not sometimes. So
A lot
of the.
Yeah, so it's very complicated, and you really have to think about how a major change in one industry can impact, other changes. And that's why I was speaking a bit more about agriculture than you probably thought I would given the project.
No, but it's really important.
Are ways to improve agriculture is in a really bad way right now. Almost everywhere in the world, we are losing topsoil. And one of the reasons is because people are using too much urea, too much ammonia, because they think, oh, I'll increase the yield this year by 2 to 3%, but eventually there's no topsoil and everything's just sliding right off and you can't grow anything and and desertification is increasing. So we really need to focus on older ways of farming, all the different ways that we can fix these things so that, we have enough materials and we have enough arable land and we have enough for people to grow and for our population to continue growing. It's all very interconnected. You feel like it's like whack-a-mole. You solve a problem here and then up comes another problem because, they also need the same thing. So you really have to look at it holistically. But I think you really need to think about the huge, the very large industries the most. And this fighting over a hydrogen car or an electric car is just absolutely worthless. This is not going to change things. Yes, the shipping industry, like on land shipping using trucks and using major trucks and trains, like those using hydrogen can be a huge benefit. But it's not about people in their personal cars. And for some reason, I guess because we're people, we always try to take it back to like us and our experience. And, and the fact is that's not going to solve the problem. We need to solve the problem on a much higher, much more boring industrial level.
Thank you. No, it's really interesting because you have even touched many points that I'm trying to do with my many hats, working on soil, working on biology, on regeneration, enhancing carbon in the soil, because I've seen decreasing yields, farmers, even here in this side of the world, losing and desertification going. And I really, if I can take one key point, focus on the boring issue. I really like that. It's not, for us in this side of the world, we are still building. So cement, aluminium, steel, and all of that, they will be the forefront and of our battles and chemicals. And especially chemicals, as we know, the impact of chemicals is really important, not only from the production side, but also on the way we use and produce and the pollution that we have discussed.
And waste.
And waste. The forever chemical we have discussed in previous episodes and their impact on human health and planet health. It has been a refreshing episode for us to see that technology are there. It is possible. I invite you maybe on the next project to come also to the Rift Valley to tap with our geothermal power for your next project. But it's really how to think systemically and holistically, not just solving I need the car or the discussion that you have at the table. I like the hydrogen, I like the AC, but it's really a different type of story. So thank you so much. It has been a pleasure, Alicia, and really I'm humbled and honored to have this episode. Thank you.
Wow, I'm not sure I deserved all that, but thank you for having me on.
Are you satisfied after this wonderful episode? Let's continue together our sustainability journey.